It's lovely to see you all today, and thanks for attending. Few housekeeping rules. If you could ensure that you're on mute while the speakers are speaking, that would be much appreciated. The session is being recorded, as you should just have heard a notice, and it will be posted on the Knowledge Hub in a few days. If you have any concerns regarding this, please do email one of us here at Tyfu Cymru. If you accidentally leave the meeting, you can rejoin using the same link. We hope that this workshop will be an interactive session, so we do encourage you to unmute yourselves and ask away. However, if you would prefer, there is always the chat feature, which is in the bar at the bottom, and you can pop your questions in there. So I'd just like to introduce you all to David Talbot and Thomas James from ADAS, their leading consultants, and they will be taking the lead on today's workshop. So over to you, David and Thomas.
Peat-free compost.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Right, if I can get you to move on to the next slide, please, Johnny. So today's workshop is a peat-free workshop, as Sarah said. I'm going to cover some of the theory, and Thomas is going to update you on some recent trials work that's been done. So if we could go on to the next slide, and just on the questions to make it as interactive as possible. Happy to take. I think we got a bit of an echo link to you, Charles. I see you've just muted, and that seems to have sorted out. Right. As interactive as possible, so I'm happy to take questions as they come along, because it's often best to sort of seize the moment when we're talking about a specific thing, rather than leaving it a few slides on and it's moved on from people's thought. Anyway, that's that, and here we go. So the objectives of today's talk are really to support your transition to peat-free production. Now, I appreciate everyone's probably on a different phase of a journey, so to speak. Like Charles has said, he's been using peat-free for many years very successfully and not having any major problems with it. And other people will be just starting or just getting going. Some might be going down the peat reduction route and gradually transitioning to peat-free. And it's doing what's right for your business, really, to get there, because we know we've all got to get there. And we're really looking to get the best out of different types of growing media. It's quite a culture change for people moving away from peat, because peat's tried and tested, been used for decades, and is very well researched as a growing media. So we know how to manage it, know its properties, and know how to get the best from it. But whatever type of growing media you're using, I would say one of the key to success is correct water management, and we'll come back to that in a little more detail as we move through the talk. And we also need to think about managing crop nutrition and how that might be a little bit different in a peat-free growing media. And hopefully we'll give you all the information you need to help achieve good results from peat-free mixes. So next slide, please. So it's a bit of a controversial point, but one I want to make. Peat-based or peat-free mixes, for the majority of plants, does it really matter? The plant doesn't actually know whether it's grown in peat or a peat-free mix. And if we give everything that that plant needs, there's no reason why it shouldn't perform. So there's various things that are important with growing media. So these are often linked to sort of what's referred to as the growing media physical properties. And I don't want to get too bogged down in the science of this, but just want to give you some of the basics to sort of aid the thought process, really. So there's a thing called Airfield Porosity, which every growing media has. And that's basically linked to the size of the particles in that growing media, and that growing media's ability to hold both oxygen and water. So depending on the crop you're growing, your growing media supplier will supply a mix with a different airfield porosity. So it would be lower for, say, a bedding crop compared to a nursery stock type crop, particularly one grown outside, which is going to be subjected to winter rainfall, etc. So the higher the airfield porosity, the better the drainage is really. But I also want to make the point that roots need oxygen, and people sometimes forget this. And if you overwater a growing media, basically those air particles you'll replace with water, and then as the growing media drains, that gradually gets replaced with air. But if you replace them with water, depending on how well drained your bed is, and how well drained the growing media is, you can get anaerobic conditions in that growing media. So the roots won't have sufficient oxygen for respiration, and this can cause root rots. And basically what I'm saying is if you, whatever the growing media is, if you don't manage it properly, i.e. you overwater it, you won't get the results you want. So important point to think that roots need air, and we shouldn't have the growing media always saturated. Also touching on pH, pH tends to be a bit higher in peat-free mixes, just because of the characteristics of the materials used. We traditionally think of pHs in growing media being in the range sort of 5.5 to 6. Now pH is important because we know nutrient availability is linked to pH. So that range that I've mentioned, that's sort of the optimum availability of nutrients. But if we're a bit higher, the nutrient availability is still pretty good. So we don't need to get too hung up on being slightly above that range in a peat-free mix. Also thinking about nutrient uptake and the balance of nutrients within the growing media. Basically, we don't want to give things too many nutrients because that can cause problems, and that's something people don't always think about. So various nutrients such as calcium, magnesium and potassium are actually similar sized cations. And again, I don't want to get too bogged down with the science here, but basically if we give an excess of any one of those, it can interfere with the uptake of the others. So for instance, if we give high potassium, we can start to induce magnesium deficiency because it's interfering with the uptake. So we don't want to be giving things too much of anything. So that's an important point to remember. And following on from that, most nutrients we supply as salts. So this takes us on to our next point of conductivity within the growing media. So we measure the amount of salt in a growing media as a thing called electronic conductivity. It's just how it's measured. It's a measure of salts using sort of electrodes, and that can be done with handheld EC meters, which are a few £100, and we'll come on to those in a bit more detail further on, or it can be done by sending a sample to the lab. And it's just an important point to make, because if you supply excess nutrients, not only do you run the risk of the nutrient incompatibility I've just mentioned, but if you get high conductivity, it can cause problems, because basically the salt level in the growing media rises, and that can draw water out of the roots and can ultimately kill your plants. So and even if it doesn't get bad enough to kill your plants, it can check their growth. So it's important just to have that in mind. Okay, so if we can go on to the next slide. So it's essential to learn how to manage different mixes. As I sort of alluded to with the watering, no mix will perform properly unless it's managed correctly. And just on watering, I would say watering is one of the most skilled jobs on any nursery. So don't be tempted to put the agency staff on it without proper training, because they can do more harm than good in many cases. And just to sort of emphasize that point, whoever's watering needs really to have an idea of the crop's requirements. So crops like Daphnes that are prone to root rots, they should have that, or Choicea, they should have that sort of level of knowledge not to really overwater these crops, because they're going to potentially create you problems, depending on the time of year, more crucial at certain times of year. And then also thinking about peat-free's different characteristics. They typically have a drier surface. It depends a little bit on the constituents of a mix, but certainly if there's any coir in there, it will have a drier surface. And if people are just looking visually at the crop and thinking about how they water it, I would say that's not a good thing. I wouldn't ever advocate that with a peat-based mix. There's nothing like picking up a few pots to get the weight of them, and even better, knocking a few plants out to see what the moisture status actually is within that pot. So those are important points to remember. But these drier surfaces, they do give us quite a few benefits potentially. If we're maintaining the crop and are not running a very wet watering regime, this drier surface can help with our weed control to a degree. It can create a less ideal environment for weeds to germinate, particularly mosses and liverworts, which are lower plants that really require very wet conditions to thrive. So that's quite a useful benefit that we're getting from peat-frees. And also that drier surface can make it a bit more inhospitable for common weeds to grow. So I'm sure many of you will have problems with Salix cyprea, the goat willow, which blows in sort of any time from May to July, depending on the season. And willow seedlings germinate and rapidly grow, and if they're not pulled out, they soon get to a size, and it can be a lot of extra work hand weeding that particular weed. And it's just an important point to make, because if you're actually trying to grow willow, which is typically done on a field nursery, you need to get the conditions right and the moisture right to get it to go. If it's too dry, it risks failing. So drier surface can help prevent the germination of some weeds such as that. Just making the point, some growers gradually transition into peat-free mixes rather than sort of making the jump straight to peat-free. Most of the peat-free mixes these days are pretty good from the main suppliers. They perform pretty well, and the trials work has backed that up in recent years, and haven't really seen many major problems. There are a few sort of horror stories of peat-frees not performing, but those are from older mixes. That so if you're new to peat-free, don't be frightened is the message. Really give it a go and see how you get on, and just think about the mix. Be aware it's got to be managed differently to your typical peat-based grown media that you may have been growing in. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the biggest things I would say would be beware of preconceived ideas. So people often have the idea that peat-frees dry out more quickly than peat-based mixes, and in some cases they do. But think about what you're doing, because I see more problems with crops overwatered and with root rots and killed as a result of overwatering than underwatering. And that's often people thinking the peat-free dries out more quickly, I need to give it more water. And as I said, that's true for certain mixes. And it's normally more of a problem once the crop starts to get established. So when the crop's recently potted, it might not dry out as quickly as you think. So that monitoring is absolutely essential to get the good results that you need to achieve. And managing that mix in relation to the weather and also the skill of a waterer. So whoever's watering, particularly at the end of the week on a Friday, sometimes there's the temptation, particularly as the weather improves this time of year, to give everything a good soaking on the Friday, to get it through the weekend, to make it easier for weekend waterers, or if there isn't a weekend watering rota, to carry it through to the Monday. But they really need to think about what they're doing in relation to the weather. If we've got a god-awful wet weekend forecast, the last thing you want to be doing is soaking every crop up, particularly things that we know don't like those sorts of conditions, because it could take a long time for them to dry out, and that could start to introduce root rots depending on the crop. So just another point to consider. And just making the point, there is some technology available these days to aid irrigation management, which differs in different mixes. So there's a bit of kit called the Evaposensor, and there was quite a lot of AHDB funded trials done on that a few years ago. And there's a whole report out there which you should be able to find online should you want it, which has used that as a scheduling aid for irrigation. There's other companies as well. Another example is 30 megahertz, and their kit does not only water but other things such as the electronic conductivity, so the amount of salts in the growing media as well. And some of these systems can be set up to monitor automatically and feed into your computer systems depending on how high tech you want to get. Okay, next slide. So just thinking a bit more about crop nutrition in peat-free mixes, and a couple of the potential most common problems that are likely to occur. So you can get a bit of nitrogen deficiency occurring. So just a bit of background again here. We've got carbon to nitrogen ratios going on in any mix. So peat was fairly stable in that it didn't lock up a lot of, it wasn't that biologically active. So I'm just going to answer that point about wetting agents in the chat that I've just seen flash up. Yes, I would say they're worth using even in a peat-based mix or a peat-free mix, and it's worth discussing with your growing media supplier. Peat can be quite hydrophobic, so repels water when it's very dry. So it's worth using wetting agents in any mixes. Yeah. So back to nitrogen deficiency. So woody-based materials have high carbon ratio, and naturally they want to break down, as everything does in nature. And the bark will be matured, and wood fibres that have additional nitrogen added to counteract this. But depending on the length of the crop, it could become not a major problem, but it could become something to be aware of, particularly in nursery stock type crops longer term, particularly if sales are a bit slower and the crop's with you for a bit longer than you'd perhaps like, and the controlled release fertilizer is starting to run out. So what actually happens, the microbes that start breaking down the woody material actually consume a bit of nitrogen in that process, and then they effectively rob it from the crop. So that's typically why you might start to see a bit of nitrogen deficiency. Now, that nitrogen isn't lost, it will be released at some point in time, probably when the crop's left your nursery and you've planted in the ground. But it's just something to flag up, really. And nitrogen deficiency is pretty easy to spot once you've got your eye in. It's a mobile nutrient, so when plants get a bit short of nitrogen, they'll actually transport it from the lower leaves to the growing points. It's sort of a survival strategy to keep growing when nutrients are in shorter supply. So you'll start to see the lower leaves going a bit yellow, and a reduction in vigor. So those are a couple of points to look for. Also see some temporary iron deficiency about, and that's normally linked to management of the crop. It can occur under a couple of conditions, really. One, if the crop's been overwatered. Now, iron's only taken up by the very fine root hairs, and if you've got very wet conditions, those fine root hairs die. They will regrow as growing conditions improve, but it'll take a few days typically, and when they've died, you've got no iron uptake. So that can show as a temporary iron deficiency, which is typical yellowing on the newest growth, and that can be a potential problem. Or it can also occur when the crop is growing really rapidly, and it's just unable to take up sufficient iron for its needs. Now, those are the scenarios when we can see it, but the key is to managing the crop to help prevent it. So try not to maintain really wet conditions. And if you start to see it in the crop, it's worth drying it back a bit and trying that. But you can apply iron chelates to correct it as well. And one product, there are various ones, but one product seems to work very well is a product called Solufeed Rapid, which is applied as a drench, and that it seems to do what it says on the tin. It gives a rapid correction of the problem and greens them up nicely.
David, I think we've got a question from Gary.
Yeah, so I'll go to a chat. Okay, fire away, Gary, if it's not in the chat.
We've very high calcium in our water, dissolved calcium, which affects the nutrients. What do you, how's the best management strategy for that?
Yeah, okay, well, with water, that's borehole, I think, isn't it, Gary?
Yeah, we had a little bit of acid to bring I think we're down, I think, if you like, static out of the boreholes, 250 milligrams, is it, or micrograms? I'm not sure.
Yeah, is that your bicarb level?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And then I think we had a bit of acid, and around about 100, I guess we're at now.
Yeah. Okay. So
what? First thing is, what's the recommended? Because I know you need a bit of bicarb, and but obviously you don't want to have too much because that affects your nitrogen and nutrient level. Yeah.
So basically, just to touch on water, you don't need to get too hung up on the pH of your water, because the biggest influence that water quality can have on growing media is the level of bicarbonates, and as Gary's alluded to here. So Gary's saying his bicarbonates before treatment are coming in at about 250 milligrams a litre. So if Gary applied that water to his crops without any sort of treatment, those bicarbonates would gradually push up the pH of the growing media. And it's more of a problem in longer term crops like nursery stock than shorter bedding type crops. So there's a couple of different approaches you can take depending on how extreme the levels of bicarbonates are. You can work with your growing media supplier and start with a slightly lower pH to allow for that push up that's going to happen while the crop's with you. But the general recommendation is if your bicarbonates are over about 200 milligrams per litre, as Gary's are, to dose with nitric acid to bring those down, for a couple of benefits really, to stop that gradual push up of pH of growing media, which impacts on your nutrient availability, and also another problem that high bicarbonate levels can give, particularly on sort of evergreen crops. You can get sort of calcium deposits precipitating out after irrigation, and it gives sort of a grey look, particularly on shiny evergreen foliage. So addressing it with nitric acid where your bicarbs are on the high side solves that problem really. So yeah, that sounds good what you're doing really, Gary.
And what do you say what would you say was one of my issues is, I put it very simply, but actually if I measured the pH now of the dissolved bicarbs in the water now, it'd be probably around about a bit less than 200.
Yeah.
If we pump hard through the summer, end of August, it'll be 300. So although I said you're 250, so there's a bit of a management in terms of acid. But what would you suggest was the 70 to 100 parts per million? Is it dissolved calcium? Is a reasonable level to have in your water, or what's your aim for in that level?
So you've got to be careful, because if you knock out all your bicarbonates, you'll actually knock out calcium as well, and plants need a bit of calcium. So what you're doing sounds good. If your acid dosing is taking it down to just less than 200, that's about perfect really. But it sounds like
you're saying, you say I've been aiming for about 100, right?
Yeah.
And you're saying about 200 though.
Yeah, potentially that would be fine.
Yeah.
As long as you're not getting any deposits on your evergreens with that sort of level.
Yeah.
And then when your bicarbs go up in the summer from your borehole, are you still getting down to
well, we monitor it. I mean, it's not a dramatic thing. You can do it every week. Sort of look at what your water is in your tank, and if you find your dissolved levels above 200, you might increase your dosing a little bit, just to compensate. So it's kind of it goes like that, a bit up and down a bit, but it's generally speaking, I try and keep it around about 100. But if you're saying that's too low, I'd be more than happy to reduce my acid dosing.
Yeah, well, and also the acid dosing, it's generally nitric acid people use, so that's applying some nitrogen to the crop. And if you're supplying too much, potentially might give you too much vigorous growth and all the associated potential problems with that, like more pest and disease if you've got more lush growth about. So lots to consider really. So what's your, sorry, so you're saying the dissolved level of bicarb is around about 150, would you say would be fair, or what do you? As long as it's less than 200, that's fine. So.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Fine. Okay. So actually, what I'm doing is probably pushing a bit hard. I could back off a little bit, to be fair.
Yeah, and it also flags up the importance of probably doing a water analysis if you haven't done one recently, and it's probably in your case quite. I mean, the most important thing is to look at it after acid dosing, because that's what the crop's getting, but there'd be no harm in looking before as well. And then we'll have an idea of the other nutrient levels, so the amount of calcium, etc., in there, and how that fits with sort of the parameters we want to be working with, really.
Yeah. So, all right. Fine. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on. I've seen in the chat like to talk about shared experience, so we'll come back to that in a little while. Okay, so if we can move on to the next slide, please. So just thinking a bit more about nutrition in peat-free mixes. As I'm sure you're aware, there's various options for supplying nutrition. Many of you in the nursery stock world will be using controlled release fertilizers. You might be doing some liquid feeding or a combination of the two. And just a point to flag up, we've been doing some nutrition trials funded by AHDB, and one of the sort of key findings that seems to be coming out of those, although we haven't quite finished writing them up yet and crunching the data, but it seems that where we've been doing a combination of controlled release fertilizer and liquid feeding with a reduced level of controlled release fertilizer, liquid feeding at 1% weekly seems to have given us the best results. So that's quite a nice outcome to have from that, because previously we kind of thought little and often, i.e. a low rate with every feed or watering, was perhaps better, but that hasn't shown through in our results. So also thinking about managing nutrition, monitoring with the handheld devices. So it's useful to have a Hanna EC meter. They're about £300, or a ProCheck, which is a bit more, about 500. The ProCheck has 3 probes, so it's probably a little bit more accurate. It's just how important you think it is getting a handle on your EC, and how much you want to spend, really. And then not forgetting lab analysis for nutrients. So that can be a useful thing if you're unsure of the nutrient status of your crop, and you'll get a report back. We typically use NRM labs for this. The only thing is, just to flag up that you might struggle to interpret the results you get back, but someone like myself can help through the Tyfu Cymru scheme to do that and tell you what the levels mean, whether they're high, low, medium, or whether there's anything to worry about. So we're typically looking for the level of electronic conductivity that we talked about, the levels of nitrogen and key nutrients, so potassium, phosphorus, magnesium. And if you get a problem with a crop, it's a useful thing to do to try and help pinpoint what that problem might be. Quite often it's a buildup of electronic conductivity, and we can address that by crop management. So if that electronic conductivity, either salt level in the mix gets too high, we can flush that away with a program of typically about 3 heavy waterings to leach those salts out of the growing medium. And this approach can be taken for some nutrients, but not all, because not all of the other nutrients are as soluble as the salts. But we really want to avoid doing this if we can through good management of the crop, because we don't want to be leaching nutrients away for 2 reasons. It's a waste of nutrients and it's a cost, and it's not really that great for the environment, particularly thinking about nitrates. So,
Gary, do you have your hand up again?
Yeah, sorry, me again. Just to be clear, did you say it was better to feed once a week? Because we feed very low all the time, but you're saying it's better to do a 1% feed once a week than feed all the time.
That's what our recent trials work has shown, yeah. But that was only looking at 4 test species, so it is a little bit of a limited data set. But it's what's working for you a bit, Gary. I mean, if your low rate feeding is working, you know.
Well, yeah, okay. Well, generally, when we started doing that, we found overall quality of the crops was better.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
So okay, well, fair enough. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also it's the practicalities of once a week feeding. Because if you fed once a week, say on a Wednesday, and not every crop needed watering and it missed that feed, you might.
Well, it's easy. Yeah, you're right, because it's easy for me to organise. You know, I can just get the dosing tank filled up and it just runs itself, you see. So in practical terms, it's quite straightforward.
Yeah. So if it works for you, I'll stick with that, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay, fine.
Okay, next slide then, please. Okay, so that takes us to sort of the end of the nitty-gritty of my slides. I just wanted to talk through another couple of points. So on the growing media analysis, very occasionally you pick up problems. So we had a problem with one growing media mix, and it was probably linked to a coir component because chloride level was very high. And it's unusual, and I don't want to frighten anyone off using coir in a mix. And it can occur occasionally if the coir has been washed in more saline type water in the place of production. It's not a big problem typically with the main growing media suppliers, so it's not something I would lose too much sleep over, but it was a problem in a mix, and we were able to pinpoint that and raise that with the growing media supplier and help the grower through that. Just also water quality, we talked about that a bit with Gary, and it shouldn't be a major problem for that many of growers in Wales, but just thinking about your water quality. I had an instance where a grower sank a borehole and spent quite a lot of money doing that and built their water system based around that. So they had a mains backup as well, and they hadn't done any water testing, and they were not far from spa towns, and the sulfates in that water was very high, so that's pushed their EC up very high. So just to put that into perspective, the conductivity of your irrigation water should be no higher than 850 US centimeters for established crops, or 600 for plugs. Now their EC was coming in at 1,710, so you can instantly see there's a problem there. And it wasn't just the EC that was a problem. The sulfate is pushing up that EC. The salt level, the sodium was high. That was over double what it is the maximum level we want to be looking at. And that high level of sulfate actually pushes up the pH as well. So there are lots of problems going on. Also, their mains water wasn't great quality either. The salt level was high, and that again linked to the geology of the area. So they'd spent all this money on this borehole water capture system without doing some basic checks, and it sort of resulted in a need for a total rethink. So they really had to focus on rainwater capture to capture and use as much rainwater as they could. So they then had to put in a reservoir, and that the reason for capturing all that rainwater was to dilute this poor quality water and blend it with that to make it usable, basically. And then I've got another grower who's downstream from a sewerage outlet, and they'd been using the water for a few years. And they've recently been doing some more testing, and they've picked up that the salt levels are too high from there. Now, we think that's linked to out charge of sewage outlet, because we've tested upstream of a sewage outlet and salt levels are okay. So that has also resulted in a change in how we manage their abstraction into their reservoir. So they try and abstract in the winter when the stream's at high flow, working on the principle that we'll get as much dilution as possible of the output from the sewage plant, which is continuous. It's not just happening at certain times of the day. And also we're trying to capture as much rainwater as we can through their recycling systems. So it's been a change of approach. We're not cracking on and filling the rainwater up when the winter filling the reservoir up when the winter abstraction season starts. We're holding off with that and looking to get as much rainwater into that reservoir as we can. And then as sort of the winter finishes, thinking, well, how much do we need to abstract? So it's a bit of a balancing act, but that has actually got the salt level down in their main reservoir to nearly where we want to be for the start of the irrigation season. And so that's been a change in management that's helping to address some of their problems. So,
David, sorry again, it's me.
That's right.
What's your view on watering? Does watering from underneath, so in other words, not with sprinklers, just on a capillary bed or a flood bed or something like that, alter the, as a different, is it still the same impact as watering with sprinklers? You know what I mean? Because with watering with sprinklers, you're actually washing through, whereas watering underneath, they're sucking up kind of what they need. So I just wondered if it has watering with sprinklers have a leaching effect on the nutrients within the compost, I suspect.
Yeah.
You know, what's your view? What I'm getting at is there a significant difference between watering from underneath or watering with sprinklers in terms of the nutrient levels within the compost?
Yeah, there will be, because you'll get less nutrient leaching, as you say, and particularly with nitrates, which nitrogen is prone to leaching. We know that. Also, with sub-irrigation, you're not going to get the leaching of salts, so that might potentially be a problem. So you wouldn't want to be, you know, it's worth if you are using sub-irrigation, worth raising that with your grow media supplier and saying, this crop, I want this mix to work for sub-irrigation, because it'd be useful for them to know that you're not going to get much leaching of salts from overhead irrigation. So that might affect the rates of controlled release fertilizer they use to account for that, to save any problems, basically. But generally, sub-irrigation systems give a lot of other benefits. You're keeping that foliage dry, and you're reducing the crop's susceptibility to disease for key crops as well, such as lavenders, hebes, which are very prone to foliar diseases, particularly at certain times of year. So yeah, they're a good system to have. More expensive to put in, of course, but
yeah. I was just trying to weigh up, you know, going forward with the peat-free, you know, there's an issue about maintaining nutrient levels because of what you said about the wood fibre, and whether, you know, the potential for a new development here, so we kind of considering doing sub-irrigation. But I think what's all the pointers are saying is there's an advantage all round.
Yeah. And I wouldn't get, again, I was making the point about nitrogen, but I wouldn't get too hung up on it, because the growing media suppliers are obviously aware of that, and they'll be putting in a base fertilizer with a slow release form of nitrogen to counteract that and stop that being a problem for you. So it's sort of addressed, really. It's just as the crop gets older.
It just costs more. When you're buying 1 or 2 meters of compost, it's expensive. And just another point, I have had 1 or 2 people ask me over the years about making their own growing media from leaf mold and such, particularly smaller growers, or even recycling spent growing media from dead plants. And as you've gathered from what I've talked about, growing media is quite a technical thing, and I wouldn't go there, because if you get things wrong, like the airfield porosity, nutrient levels, you're destined for failure, really. And also, if you're recycling dead or old plants, if they're not properly composted, you're also running the risk of reintroducing the diseases that may have killed those plants, particularly root diseases. So I wouldn't go there. Just a shot. Sorry, can I ask? I seem to be hijacking your presentation, so I apologise for that.
That's all right. We wanted to be interactive.
But this leads into well, I was probably going to tap you up at some point, residual herbicides, and how that performs on peat-free reduced peat compared to normal peat. My feeling is, and I mean, just because we've been using a bit less, we're down to 50% peat now, that's the performance is definitely different in terms of longevity, and I'm a bit nervous as well about it leaching. So I've been backing off the rates as well, because it's a new, I'm concerned that it'll leach through in the peat, the reduced peat / peat-free, then more so than the peat, because the peat tends to suck it up, I guess. So what's your view on that? Because that's, potentially a bigger problem really than getting the watering right, is if I start putting residual herbicides on to reduce the weeds. Yeah, I take your point. There is a benefit if you keep them dry. There's definitely less weeds in the peat-free / wood fibre, but nevertheless, we still have to apply some residuals to it. So, what's your thinking on that?
Yeah, well, we've actually done some work on that not that long ago, and I mean, as a general sort of school of thought, residual herbicides on thinking more in the soil than growing media, in a soil with more than 10% organic matter, tend to be a bit less effective, because they're sort of bound more strongly to the organic matter. We did some work on some key actives. So we looked at Flexidor, Dual Gold, and I think it was Sunfire, which is a graminicide, residual herbicide for grass. And I can't remember the exact results off the top of my head. It'd probably be useful to refresh myself with that and revisit that with you, if that's useful.
Yeah, it would be, because we had a weed problem more so the last couple of years. As we've gone to 50% reduced, I seem to be getting more of a weed problem than I've had previous years.
Yeah. I mean, from memory, it differed between the different actives. So there wasn't a general message that can be applied to all residuals in peat-free. So that's why I want to refresh myself with it to update it properly.
I think what I'm trying to get over is, as we go more to peat-free, there's then another layer of complexity in terms of what residual. Well, there's a question mark of what will be available, but nevertheless, at the moment, there's definitely another layer of complexity in terms of now applying your residual herbicides is not as it was a few years back when it was straight peat.
No.
Right, there's definitely some, I'm on another learning curve as it was, so any insight to that would be very helpful.
Yeah. Quiet. Sorry, your dog's seen something out the window. We'll revisit that, Gary. And right, so anyone like to share their experience of peat-free growing, or any problems they've had or successes while we're all here in this forum?
Well, sorry again, we're just running trials on peat-free now. We've done, I'll be upfront, we use ICL, very professional outfit. They will see it as something they've got to adapt to going forward, so they're up for it for running peat-free trials. We did peat-free last year with geraniums. The issues you've outlined is actually the issues we had in terms of the plants were still saleable at the end of the season. It was geranium, so it was a short-term crop, but they were, you could see there was issues around the nutrients within the compost. Okay, because ICL are trying to find what's the appropriate level for them as well in what they put in the compost as well. And but nevertheless, the plants grew and we still sold them. So in terms of that success, compared to peat, the quality wasn't quite as good, but it might have been a nutrient issue more than a compost issue. And we found a similar experience now. We potted some in the autumn, trial some in the autumn. We potted some last summer. We potted some in the autumn as a trial, 4 different mixes. 2 of the mixes we're going to take forward. I can't remember the exact components of them. And we're doing another trial in a few weeks of the 2 we preferred mixes. But again, compared to the peat-free, it's although I'd say this second trial, the nutrient level is better managed, it's still not at the same level as, say, the general mix we've been using. So it's better, but not the same. So we're hoping these next 2 trials, we're tweaking the AFP, as you said, to try and improve that, because what we're finding is as it degenerates, your AFP reduces as well. So there's an issue around that as well. So I mean, it was something I was very scared of a few years. I'm still a little bit scared of it, but not as scared as I was.
Yeah, I mean, it can be done, and Gary's highlighted an important point there. He sort of go with some crops, and if you're getting those sorts of experiences, you feel you're lacking a bit of vigor or growth at a point in the growing season, that's when it's really worth thinking about doing a growing media analysis at a lab. It costs in the region of 30 quid. And then you can make informed decisions. You'll see, with a bit of help, you can see which nutrients you're lacking, if any, put those into the crop, address the issue, and no reason why that crop shouldn't perform as any other, really. So
it'd be great if we could have some, like, Charles, your experience of growing, or I think we've got Callum on the call as well.
My experience is a bit boring, really, because, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Because I went to a peat-free compost really, partly because I was restarting my business and we needed small quantities, and Melcourt would deliver a single pallet, which was really important early on. And they would do a bespoke mix as well. So that meant in those days we were still using Intercept, and they were putting Intercept in it as well as Osmocote for us initially, and then that changed to Net 52 for the vine weevil. So that's why I went to it. And also there was a kind of marketing aspect. I was trying to make my product a little bit different, and so I could just another tick in the box to make it a little bit different on the garden centre benches, really. And found the company really good to deal with, so that was really important down here. because nobody wants to deliver down here, and particularly in the small quantities that we initially were buying. So all that works really well. And we've not really had any growing. I have loads of growing problems, loads of them. Obviously, we all do, I guess, but we have crops that tend to go through quite quickly compared to, say, shrubs or anything like that, because we're growing herbs and alpine, so the herbs are fast and furious. And they're all absolutely fine. They're as good as they ever were when we used the peat-based compost. We had the Melcourt issue. I don't know if you're not aware of the issue that they had, then it's probably best not to go into it too much. But they had an exotic fungi which got into it, which was really unusual. It was having a really strange effect on the root zone. It wasn't infecting the plant, but it was growing into the compost, into the materials the compost was made of, and had this really strange effect. They struggled to get to the bottom of it. I'm not sure what the outcome finally was. I know they tried really hard, and I stuck with them through it, although a lot of people got very cross about the whole thing, but I felt they were doing their best, so hang on with them. That was the biggest effect. We got it particularly in lavenders. I was just beginning to grow a few lavenders. It's not a big thing for us, but I was just trying them out. And so initially, when I was learning to grow the lavenders, we had this additional problem of this fungi causing a weird effect in the root zone. All the feeding things that you've been talking about, I mean, I've just been potting some mint this morning, and they looked a little deficient because they're growing so bloody fast. They're incredibly fast. The cuttings probably only taken 2 weeks ago. So even in this time of year, and I'm potting them today. So they're really quick, and they're looking really yellow. They'll get into the potting compost, and within a few days, I'll be taking cuttings from them, and then they won't be yellow anymore. They'll be green then. So none of those really come up with such a quick turnaround of the crop. So we're sowing things like coriander 1 week, potting it the next, and then selling it a week later once it gets a little warmer. So it's a really quick turnaround. We don't have any of those kind of issues that you might find if you had longer term crops. Some of the alpines are there for longer, and rosemary we do 1 year, get it into a line of 1 year, and then sell it in a litre the following year. So it's there for a year, and we treat them like you treat a shrub, I suppose. We have about 8 different varieties, and they're some of the best rosemary you'll ever see from a UK grower. They're a little different to the ones that come in the Dutch lorries from Italy or wherever they come from. But they're as good as anything that you'll see from a British grower, and people love them obviously because they've not usually offered a choice of varieties and things like that. So we've not really had any issues with the peat-free aspect. Lots of other issues, but not really any issues with that. The compost that keeps its structure quite well, like peat tends to do, or good peat, because not all peat's the same. Some peat is. When I first came here, the only stuff I could get was absolutely dreadful, terrible old structureless peat, and that was all I could get here. Amazed that I ever grew anything in that, really. So it performs quite well in that sense. And then after I decided to use a peat-free compost, I got involved very much on the periphery of a peatland management thing in Carmarthenshire. My partner is a biodiversity officer in Carmarthenshire, and they ended up managing 3 peat bog sites, which had been grazed in the past and had grazing rights on them, but hadn't been grazed recently, really, and just been left. They've been drained quite a lot, and so they worked on the management with that. And so we started visiting some of these places, and they are so important places that it made me realise that after that, I had one visit where we took peat cores and did some geophysics and all that kind of stuff, and had a whole day on with some people doing the PhDs, and it was an eye, and I wouldn't grow now. I don't think. I think I'm at the point where if I didn't have a peat-free alternative, and that's possible, I suppose, in the future, that I wouldn't grow in peat again now. But that's just me. That's just my little thing, you know. But I'd probably give up growing if we couldn't get a supply that didn't have peat in it. So that's how strongly I feel about that now. And that's been the journey, really. I mean, it's been pretty simple and straightforward. Apart from this exotic fungi that we had, and that caused problems for a couple of years, we've not really had any issues.
Thank you, Charles. Thanks for sharing that. I think there's a similar question in the chat there, David, about the fungi.
Yeah, just spotted that. So a couple of points there. If you're reusing pots or containers, couple of points. So disinfectants won't kill weed seeds. So if you've had a high burden of weeds, really it's questionable whether it's worth reusing those containers unless they can be thoroughly washed and weighing up the cost and time of doing that. There has been work done on cleaning them up with heat, and there's some information out on sort of heat sterilisation of pots, but that's another subject area which we haven't really got time to go into now. But with sort of disinfectants, I'd be more inclined to use a proper horticultural disinfectant like Jet 5. It's a good broad spectrum, has activity against most of the diseases that are potentially going to be a problem, and will help to prevent disease carryover on pots and containers. So saying about the fungi you've got growing in pots, that might not be linked to dirty pots. It might just be the biological nature of that peat-free grow media. It is more biologically active, and we've got to remember that woody material, which a lot of them consist of, or a proportion of, naturally wants to break down, and we will see fungi, etc., growing in the media, and most of the time that doesn't cause a problem. Charles has highlighted that very occasionally it can, but that's an exception to the norm, really, I would say.
Can I just expand on that a little bit? We get a lot of ink caps and things like that coming from Melcourt, and everybody does, really. And they tend to come up in the morning. You go down there, so it's a bit of a shock, really. Some mornings you go and there's loads of them. I'm actually quite interested in fungi, so they don't frighten me at all. I'm more likely to take a photograph of them. And usually by midday, or if they go outside or anything like that, they just melt away and disappear. That's not been a problem with the retailers. Nobody's actually ever mentioned it to me at all, which I'm surprised, really. The problem that we had was different to that. This was an exotic fungi that had only recently had records of it being in the UK at all. It's a thing called a warty cavalier, and it wasn't that it just grew. This was like a proper big white mushroom. This wasn't like little ink caps, and I think we've had a few other species that have appeared. It wasn't like that, and it didn't just grow on the. It was growing on the growing media, but it had the strangest effect on the compost. Melcourt were calling it hydrophobic because it looks like water wasn't penetrating the bits where the fungi were. It wasn't that, but it was having an odd effect. It changed the colour of the compost in very distinct regions. You pull a pot out, and you'd see these sort of distinct lines through the compost of this effect. So that's not related really to the normal thing of just going down in the morning and seeing lots of ink caps up there, because we get that as well. I just ignore it, and it doesn't seem. I'm surprised none of the retailers have said anything. I thought maybe one or two might have just mentioned it, but nobody has. And we've been seeing that now for years. And I don't really see them as a problem. And as you say, it might mean that it's more active, and it could actually. I mean, when we had this problem with the warty cavalier, Melcourt offered to purchase another fungi which is sort of antagonistic to it. But I had somebody working here who's also got their own fungi business, growing edible fungi, and they were aware of this thing, but they said that we were getting that anyway. Just naturally, it was naturally occurring. So I contacted Melcourt and said to them, we don't need it because we're actually getting it already. You could see it it was a bright green thing inside. Anyway, that was historic now. We had it until we had a tiny bit of it last year, and we did have to chuck some stuff, and they compensated me for that. I didn't ask for compensation because I was trying to work with them particularly. I found that particularly important, that we were going to solve it better by working together, rather than making a big fuss about it. So I never did at the time. And in the end, I think that paid off, because They seem to be struggling to get the deliveries out now, and we always get ours on time. So I think maybe that is part of the reason. So that's just to clarify that it's very different to the thing. They told me that nine nurseries had it, had this extra thing, but the thing with the ink caps and those more common fungi, that's very common, I think, and we get it all the time. But don't worry about it. I'm going to have to leave you, I'm afraid, because I've got a van to load up. But thank you very much for that. Anyway,
thanks, Charles, and thanks for your input and sharing your knowledge. And just to add to Charles what he said, you know, the fungi are generally not a real problem, and just remember that a peat-free mix is always going to be more biologically active, and that often gives us benefits in the form of disease suppression compared to a peat-based mix, which was typically more of a sterile medium. So it's a useful thing. So I'm conscious that time's pressing on, so I'd like to pass over to Thomas now to just update you a bit on some recent trials work that's been done on some peat-free mixes.
Ali, did you just have a quick question just before we
go?
go?
Quick question. I've been using Dalefoot, the sheep wool peat-free, and this year the seed compost doesn't seem to be as good as previous years because the little plants aren't growing at all. I just wondered if that was something you'd heard about.
No, it's not that widely used by commercial growers, but I mean, first instance, I'd raise it with them and see if they can shed any light on it, and you may have already done that, but if not, that's worth doing. And then if they're a bit stumped, I'd sort of seek to get a growing media analysis done and, you know, encourage them to pay for it as a supplier.
Okay. All right, yeah, that's fine, thanks. That's all.
And, you know, if you do that, Alison, and you need help interpreting the results, or you want someone independent to look at the results other than them, you know, we're happy to help with that. So yeah. Okay.
Right. Okay. I guess I'll start my bit. So just a quick introduction to me. I'm Tom. I'm one of the senior research staff at ADAS, based at Boxworth. I've been working for ADAS for around a year now. Started probably 6-7 months ago, getting involved in the growing media work. So today, really, I just want to give you a bit of an overview of 2 of the trials that we've been working on over the last sort of 6 or 7 months, really. So the 2 trials I want to talk to you about are effectively 2 very simple sort of demonstration trials, using a couple of different peat-free mixes, as well as like a nursery standard peat-reduced mix which is supplied by each of the host nurseries. So I'll just run you through what we did, what we saw, and any sort of key points that were picked up by the growers. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I'll begin on talking about the demonstration trial we did at Hills Nurseries, who are based down in Chichester. So we wanted to test 3 peat-free mixes supplied by anonymous suppliers, and we ran 2 different species of plants in each mix, as well as the nursery standard peat-reduced. So for each species, we had 64 plants per species per growing media. So that equated to about just over 500 plants that we ran this demonstration trial on. They were transplanted in week 39. The trial was managed and oversaw by the nursery and the nursery staff. They followed sort of their general practice for growing plants. So they were on an automated overhead watering system, basically just ran alongside their usual growing procedures. So we left them to that, and then the final assessments on these plants were done in week 3 in January. And yeah, they were all grown in hand-filled pots. So yeah, moving on to the next slide. So these are the 2 species that we tested on, the Calathea sylvias and the Ficus exoticus. So yeah, these are the 2 species that we used in this trial. And if we move on to the next slide, we should be able to see the 4 treatments that we used. So the pots with the blue labels, they are the peat-reduced mix. So that's the nursery standard product that was supplied by the nursery themselves. And then the yellow, the purple, and the green labeled pots are the peat-free mixes that were tested in this trial. As I said, they were anonymously supplied. So we have no idea what was in them. The nursery had no idea what was in them. So this was sort of the look and see trial to see how the plants handled the different mixes. So if we move on to the next slide. So these are some photos that we took at the final assessment of the rooting in the Calathea plants. As you can see, the blue mix, which is the top left, the nursery standard, that was probably the poorest of all 4 treatments that we had in the trial. The mix was sort of, it dried out. Once you took the plants out of the pots, it just crumbled away. The roots themselves were okay, but yeah, in terms of the actual mix, it didn't really respond well to the nursery's practice of watering. But when you compare that against the 3 peat-free mixes, they all tended to hold the soil together pretty well in comparison. There wasn't a lot of difference between sort of the roots that you can see there. They're all fairly well developed for the stage of growing that they were in. And yeah, overall from that, what we could take is actually the peat-free mixes performed better than the peat-reduced. So if we could go on to the next slide, we'll have a look at the foliage. So again, you can sort of see a bit of a difference between the peat-reduced and the peat-free mixes. Actually, the peat-reduced didn't perform well at all. You can see there's a bit of sort of crinkling on the foliage, on the leaves. And you compare that against the peat-free, the 3 peat-free mixes, the peat-free look a lot healthier, a lot better. The canopy's more well developed. The only issue we saw really with one of the peat-free mixes, which I believe was the purple one, which is the bottom left plant, is the growers commented that during the trial they had a bit of an issue with shore flies. We think that's because this particular mix held a lot of moisture, so it attracted a bit of a pest problem. But as the canopy developed throughout the trial, that kind of went away. But I think if we move on to the next slide, we should have some sort of summary results in the table. Oh, the headers have disappeared. But yeah, if you sort of follow the color code, you've got the nursery standard at the top. In that first column there is I believe that's the average height in millimeters that we had for each plant. So you can see there's a bit of a difference between the peat-free mixes, but there's the nursery standard again has sort of performed the worst out of the 4. And with treatment B, the purple mix, you can see that's a little bit shorter than treatments A and C, and we think that might have something to do with the pest problem that we saw earlier in the trial. But towards the end, it picked back up and didn't perform too bad in the end. In the middle column is sort of an average root development score that we gave. So we ranked each, well, we gave a score to each plant's root development. So we gave a score of 4 as the highest, where we've got very well developed roots, and 0 being sort of very poor or dead rooting effectively. So the higher the score in that middle column, the better. And you can see again, treatments A and C perform fairly well. B as well, to an extent, is a high score, and then you've got the nursery standard, which didn't perform so well, the peat-reduced. And then if you go into the second column from the right, you've got the average fresh weight of each plant in grams. So yeah, again, tells a similar story that the peat-free mixers had a higher average fresh weight. And in the final column on the right, you've got the average dry weight in grams, which yeah, follows a very, very similar pattern. So that's the first species of the trial. If you move on to the next slide, we can see the other species, the ficus. And this had a bit of a different story, really. With this species, there wasn't particularly any significant difference between any treatments. This plant did reasonably well in pretty much every one. The rooting's fairly consistent. If you move on to the next slide as well, you can see with the foliage, again, there's not really anything in it of any significance. And if you go on to the next slide, you've got the same table again, laid out in the same way. So in the first column, you've got the average height, and yeah, there's not an awful lot in it. Treatment A is shortest, but not when you're sort of there and you're looking at it in person, you don't really see much of a difference. With the roots as well, they were all pretty much perfect. They all performed fairly well in each mix. And again, with the fresh weights and the dry weights, you know, there's not a lot you can see there that would tell you that one's particularly better than the other. So yeah, moving on to the next slide, we've got a few comments that the growers at Hills sort of mentioned about each mix that they saw. So with the blue labels, which was the nursery standard, this was probably the one that performed the worst in the calatheas. Waterlogging was observed, poor root development. Yeah, top growth relatively consistent across all treatments in regards to the ficus. If you look at treatment A, they were reasonably happy with that. By 4 weeks after potting the treatment, the plants had relatively good root growth in both species. Treatment B was less well drained, as we sort of saw, especially with the shore fly problem that we had in the calatheas. But that was sort of a very early stage problem that reasonably sorted itself out in the end as the canopy filled out. Although roots were slightly less developed than they were in treatment A and C, but still better than was seen in the peat-reduced mix. And then yeah, they were reasonably happy with treatment C as well. The green peat-free growing media, well drained, encouraged good healthy root growth. Foliage didn't seem to cause any issues there. So that was our Hills trial that we had. And then if we move on to the next slide, we can move on to the propagation trial that we ran, which was based up at Early's Ornamentals in Thirsk. So what we did here was we ran each mix through the propagation machine to fill out the cell trays that the different species of plants were grown in. This was set up in week 1 of January. We eliminated treatment A from this one, so we only ran treatment B and C alongside Early's peat-reduced mix. Basically just sort of because of how many species we were running. So if we move on to the next slide. Yeah, just a summary of the chart of the treatments that we used again. So we'll go on to the next slide. So these are the 8 species that we tested in this trial. So we had 7 versions of seed raised species, and then we also had Sonnetti, which were cutting raised. So we had plenty of different species to sort of look at and see what the differences are between the species as well as between the peat-free mixes. So moving on to the next slide. These are sort of some overviews of the foliage. So in each of the photographs you can see, you've got the nursery standard, so the peat-reduced on the left-hand side. And then you've got treatment B, the purple labels in the middle, and the green labels treatment C on the right. These are pretty good photos actually, because particularly with the geraniums in the bottom right, you can see the gaps that were left. So what Early's have is this machine that sorts out, sort of blows the soil out of any cells that have sort of been missed in the planting stage. So you can see there's a little bit of a difference between the species and how well they actually go through that machine. Although with the geraniums, you can sort of see it's quite consistent across the board. There's not a lot of difference. But if you move on to the next slide, so you've got the Cosmos marigold at the top, and you can see there's a bit more of a difference between species, between the growing mixes in these 2 species. So if you look at both of them, you can see there's a few gaps in the peat-reduced, but there's more gaps when you start going into the peat-free. So it's not quite holding together in the cell quite as well with these particular species. However, if you look at the pansy and the Antirinum, I think you pronounce it, yeah, they were reasonably okay, pretty consistent across the board again. So if we move on to the next slide, you've got the rooting, sort of some images of the rooting here. And I know it's a bit difficult to see on these small images. It's a lot more interesting to see in person. We actually ran an in-person workshop at Early's after this trial where people could come and have a look at the rooting themselves. And so I can sort of tell you what I saw when I did the assessments in the peat-reduced kind of, when you pull the plants out of the trays, that soil kind of holds together pretty well. Probably more so than you'd get with the peat-reduced, that they tend to sort of be a lot more fragile, and the soil can break away a bit easier than you can get in the peat-reduced. But in terms of actual rooting, for most of the species, it's pretty consistent. There wasn't much of a difference for species like the Sonnetti or the geraniums or the marigolds. Rooting was fairly consistent across the board. However, when you start looking at the pansies and the mimulus, so you've got the mimulus in the bottom left here, there was a bit more of a difference. So the rooting was a bit better in the peat-reduced than it was in some of the peat-frees. If you go on to the next slide, you can have a look at the other 4 species. So yeah, again, it's difficult to see from these pictures, but pretty much across the board, peat-reduced had a very, very strong root structure. Peat-free was a little bit weaker in the pansies, the mimulus and the sonnets. And I think we've got these results tabulated in a table on the next slide. So you've got 4 other species here. You can see the average height of each plant when you compare that across the 3 treatments. For something like the Sonetti, there's a bit of a difference, not too much. Mimulus, there's a bit more difference. So treatment C didn't quite perform as well. In the actual plant quality scores, so with 5 being the highest and 0 being the lowest. Things like the Sonettis was consistent across the board. Mimulus, Pansy, to an extent, the Sonatas didn't do quite as well. Rooting, though, fairly consistent across the board. More problems with sort of the soil compaction sort of breaking away as it's moved. And mean fresh weight, again, these are very small plants, so don't read too much into that, but there's not a huge difference between treatments in terms of fresh weight. On the next slide, you've got the other 4 species. So yeah, similar story, really. There's not huge differences, really. Probably on average, you're looking at a bit more height in the peat-reduced over all 8 species, but again, there's not too much in that. Root quality as well. The petunias in particular was a little bit not as good, as well as the sonnets, but geraniums and the African marigolds roots were fairly good. So if we move on to the next slide, we've got some comments that the growers at Early's gave us. So in terms of filling the machines, treatment B was quite a coarse mixture that held quite a lot of moisture, which we kind of had a few concerns about as we were putting through the machine, because we wondered if it's quite a moist mixture, is it going to flow through the machine well? But when we started putting it through, it didn't perform too badly. It filled the trays reasonably well, as you'd want it to. And then we saw very similar again with treatment C. It was less moist, so it kind of flowed through the machine a little bit better than treatment B, but still filled the trays reasonably well. But the concerns that we saw with that, if you look at the image on the right with treatment C, you can kind of see the little fibers that stick out. So that would probably tell us that this has got a bit of coir mixed in with it. And the growers kind of had a bit of a concern where when you start moving the trays around the site or transport, moving them through transport, if things catch on those little fibers, you could end up with a bit of dislodged soil through the trays, which is obviously not ideal. But in their verdict initially from filling the trays was that treatment C was slightly more superior of the 2 mixes, but not really much in it. And I think if we go to the next slide, that should be it for me on the 2 trials that we've run so far. So if anyone does have any questions on any of the trials, please fire away.
I'll just add quickly, in trial 1, treatment B, the mix was hanging a bit wetter, where they saw a bit of poorer rooting and a bit of shore fly. If the management of that mix had perhaps been changed a little bit, it had been run a bit drier, you'd have probably got better rooting, and you might not have had such problems with a shore fly. No criticism of the trial, it's just they were probably all managed as one, the growing media, but just in a commercial situation, you can manipulate things to your advantage. And if the shore fly were a bit of a problem, you can even look at putting some biological controls in to address that. So it's all about, if you start to see problems with a peat-free mix, it's tweaking your management of it to get the best out of it. And that's one of the key messages, really, rather than just thinking it's not a good mix, it's not performing. Try and think about improving it and getting the best from it.
Can I jump in? It's I'm quite interested in propagation, because obviously when we go peat-free, they're going to legislate against any peat incoming. And I see it as not so much of an issue in propagating in peat-free as growing in peat-free, because they tend to be, the longevity of crops tends to be shorter. You can manage the nutrients through the irrigation, and then they're out of the door. So it'd be interesting. I mean, I don't see it. You know, what's your thoughts? Is it not an issue growing in peat-free for propagation, or because the results there were, I would say, were very good, you know, throughout, really, you know. So what's your thoughts on that? I'd be interested.
Sort of propagation in peat-free hasn't really been looked at probably in as much detail, because volumes are obviously lower, and it's always been seen as a sort of harder nut to crack. But I don't know whether that's necessarily the case, because as we've seen here, these trials look positive, and you know, giving us good results that we've got confidence in. So
years ago, I used to grow in Groden plug. We used to do cuttings in Groden plugs, which obviously peat-free, no nutrients in it, and the roots really well in Groden plugs. You know, they were just expensive. That's all.
Yeah.
So it was never propagation wasn't an issue, and that was back 20 years, you know, 15 years ago when I was doing loads of prop. So I don't see the propagation side as an issue, really. I think it's the growing side more with peat-free that is the big issue. Yeah, that's just my 2p worth than 20 years of growing.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
Different for every species, really, and just for the edible folks, it's those sort of cells and modules holding together as the crops are transplanted that can sometimes be a bit of an issue. But yeah, I think the whole.
I mean, then with them little cell seedlings, I mean, I don't know if they were pulling them out at what they do in normal time, but chances are under glass, another 3 or 4 days, they might have increased the volume of the root ball, you know, and it may be a case of with peat-free for propping that they're just going to hang on to it for 3 or 4 more days, you know. I'm just trying to bring my experience of propping to it, really.
Yeah. I mean, just from the commercial propagators' point of view, everything's very mechanized, and particularly in the bedding world, and transplanters, and those plugs have got to hold up to being transplanted by mechanized equipment. And if something is a bit slower, that's a big issue for the propagators with the volumes they're handling and space and all the rest of it. So yeah, I think the mixes are improving all the time, and it's interesting times, and we're just on a journey, and we've got to go with it, really.
Yeah. All right.
Well, thank you, David and Thomas, and thank you all for your participation in today's workshop. Before we close the meeting, does anyone have any further questions? You're all quiet, so I assume not. So that just leaves me just to say that you'll see in the chat box that there's a survey. We'd be really grateful if you could just complete that. That helps us plan future delivery. And thank you for attending. We'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.